Okay, so this is going to be the final video that we have, and this is going to be in that same packet that we've been working off of. So when I initially gave it to you guys, I told you that we would cover 3 lectures with it, and this is that third installment on that. So we've already run through the beginning, kind of the design of the nerve. We've looked at the spinal cord information, and now you guys should be looking at the slide that's just simply entitled Brain. So ultimately building up to um, the major part of the human body that kind of keeps everything going. So when we talk about the brain, this is going to be the grandfather of them all. This is going to be the body part that is going to make sure that everything is kept in balance. This is the body part that is going to monitor everything that happens in the body. And ultimately, when things are not where they're supposed to be, it's the job of the brain to then figure out how to get that back to where it's supposed to be. So this is a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week job. It never gets to stop. It never gets to take a break. And when we talk about our set points and our set values, and I know that was all the way back in the beginning weeks of this semester, but we talked about body temperature at 98.6 and pH level at 7.4 and blood pressure at 120/80. That is what the brain is striving to do all the time, is to meet those numbers. And whenever your body varies from those numbers, the brain is working to get you back there. So you can figure that the body is constantly going to fluctuate somewhat from those numbers and very rarely be right on point. And so, like I said, the brain is constantly monitoring the conditions of the body and then doing anything and everything it can to get back to those set point values where the body works its best. So, that first slide that you guys have talks about the functions of the brain. And when we look at the functions of the brain, kind of what I just described, um, you have sensory information, and we talked about those receptors that are buried all over through the body. And it's going to be the job of the brain to interpret that information as it comes in. So if it's thermal information, hot and cold sensations, if it's pain sensations, whatever type of information is being brought into the body, that is ultimately going to get relayed to the brain, and the brain will then figure out how to respond to that. Perception is a tricky thing because perception is actually going to be based off of your past experiences. So it's something that you build through a lifetime, and especially those that you have early on in life are really going to kind of set the tone for how you view and look at the other encounters you have throughout your lifetime. And I kind of touched on that earlier, how you can come in contact with people, and even though they're presented with the exact same situation, they will respond to it very differently. And that's because they are basing it off of their past experiences. And that's going to vary from one person to the next. So the response you get is going to vary as well. Store memory. The storing of memories is something, again, that has to be hardwired through time. And so you'll talk to some people and they have memories very, very early on in life, and other people don't really start to have memories until they're 3, 4, 5 years old. And that is something in the networking of the brain. We form our memories based off of, again, past experiences. So as you guys are exposed to things, you'll start to create kind of basically little file folders in your brain. And as you have more experiences, you'll continue to add to those file folders, and that's eventually where memories are going to arise from. And with memories, the intensity of it is going to impact when you form a memory that you will be able to recall later on. So you have those defining moments in your life, and obviously those vary from one person to the next. So that's the reason that we have people recalling memories at different times. It's just that process of that brain getting hardwired and then being able to ultimately recall those memories that you have. Reasoning is a little bit different. When we talk about reasoning, that's actually the last part of the brain to fully form. And so the capacity to reason, and not making a gender bias, this is scientifically proven. The ability to reason comes out of our frontal lobe of our brain, which is right behind the frontal bone. And in females, that is going to fully form in the late teens, early 20s. for males, that's going to be early 20s to mid 20s before that part fully forms. And like I said, not going anywhere with the gender thing, it's scientifically proven. And it has to do with the testosterone levels. With the testosterone levels being higher in the male body, that's why we see that part of the brain fully forming a little bit later on in life. It is so scientifically proven that if you look at insurance rates will drop sooner for a female than they will for a male. And I'm talking about car insurance because insurance companies are aware of this. And so they will actually keep the male car insurance higher until they reach that age of 25 and then they drop it. And the reasoning process is just the ability to look at cause and effect. If I do this, this could potentially be the outcome, and seeing all the possible things that could happen as a result of the decisions that you're making. So that actually comes after we're well established. Like I said, late teens on up to mid 20s before that part is fully formed. The ability to make decisions, and again, this would stem back to prior experiences and how those outcomes have come to pass. So you have, I think I used the car example before. You come up on a stoplight, turns yellow, you make that decision. Am I going to hit the accelerator and go through, or am I going to move my foot over to the brake and stop? That's going to depend on your experiences that you've had in the past. Coordinating muscular movements. And this actually comes from the posterior part of the brain. We'll talk about it a little bit later, the cerebellum. It's the mini-me of the brain and sits on the backside. That is largely where a lot of our muscle coordination and movement comes from. Your visceral activities, we're just talking about those internal organs. So if you think about all those body parts that work for you that you don't have to think about, that is going to be your visceral organs. So your stomach digesting food, your blood vessels dilating and constricting, all of that is going to be part of the brain, and then determines your personality. Personality is a huge debate. How much of it is nature, how much of it is nurture? And that's one thing that they have put a lot of time and effort into trying to figure out. And I think ultimately most people would say it's a combination of both, that who you are as a person is going to stem somewhat from genetics and what you're given from mom and dad, and then also from your environment and what you've been exposed to throughout your lifetime. Major parts of the brain, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here. We have another slide that I want to kind of focus on that a little bit more. You have the cerebrum, which is going to be the outer portion of the brain. So if you were to remove the skull, what you would be able to see immediately under the skull would be the cerebrum. And within the cerebrum, you have lobes, the frontal lobe, which I kind of already talked about, the parietal lobe, occipital, temporal, and then the insula. I'm going to focus mainly on the first four, the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, very nicely named for the bones that cover them. So if you think about the bones that we have in the skull, the location is the same. Right behind the frontal bone would be the frontal lobe, right underneath the parietal bone would be the parietal lobe, so on and so forth. We have the diencephalon, which again, I'll spend some more time on later, the cerebellum, and then the brainstem. The brainstem is going to be the transition between the brain and the spinal cord. And there's actually three sections that happen as we go from the brain. It'll start to taper and become more narrow and transitions then into the spinal cord. But within the brainstem, you have the midbrain, you have the pons, and you have the medulla oblongata. So if you will switch over to the slide that looks at the parts of the brain. And I know I didn't spend a whole lot of time on the other slide, but I think kind of having that visual goes a long ways. So you have two different pictures here. The top one is a computer animated picture, and then the lower one is an actual brain that has been cross-sectioned and then have a picture taken of it so that you can see a little bit of what those structures would look like. And then I believe in your textbook you have the same exact picture, so if you'd like to see it in color, you can refer to your textbook as well. So looking at the top picture that we have, you have the skull, which is obviously going to be that protective bone that you have over the surface of the brain just to help protect it. And we talked in the skeletal chapter that if you have a rounded bone, that indicates that it is going to hold a protective measure. And the skull, you can see, is very rounded in formation because it has the ultimate job of making sure that the brain is kept safe. Now, underneath the skull, you have those meningeal layers. Those are those connective tissue, very tough connective tissue layers that we have, the pia mater, the dura mater, and the arachnoid mater. that are going to help hold the brain in place. They also help that cerebral spinal fluid and keep it close to the surface of the brain as well. And if you look, there's not a lot of space between the brain and the skull. So you have enough space for that, those three Meninge layers, and then a little bit of cerebral spinal fluid, but there is not a whole lot of space within that gap. And so with that, with those Meninge layers and with the cerebral spinal fluid, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a kind of buffer so that the brain doesn't hit the bone around it with any amount of force. You can bruise the brain just like you can bruise anything else. And so it is very important to make sure that that brain is protected. When you have things like shaken baby syndrome, essentially during the um, act of shaking the baby very violently, what happens is that brain will start to rock back and forth in the skull case. And as it slams into the front, it becomes damaged and bruised, and then it will ricochet and slam into the back. And you get that forward and backward motion of the brain just hitting that bone until it becomes so bruised and damaged that it can cause permanent and long-term issues for the child. So below that, you have the cerebrum. And we talked about the spinal cord having the white matter on the outside, the gray matter on the inside. The brain is going to have the complete opposite design. So you have the gray matter on the outside, and if you were to go under that cerebrum and take that layer off, then underneath that is where you would find the white matter. So a little bit different design in the structure of the brain compared to the spinal cord. Now, I want to jump to the two terms on the top right with the gyri and the sulcus. What you're looking at with those two structures is they're talking about the folds and the grooves that you have on the surface of the brain. And with those, you don't have a smooth surface to the brain. You do have these peaks and valleys that you have within the formation, and those are actually very important. So when we look at the gyri, those are going to be the high points, and then the sulcus, those are going to be the low points. And collectively, the high and low points together are called convolutions. Now, for a long time in the research that was done on brains, they wanted to equate intelligence to the size of the brain. And so they would take these skulls after somebody had passed away and they would fill them with different materials to get an accurate representation of the size of the brain. And then they wanted to then see if that had any correlation to the intelligence of that person. And what they found is they could make no connection. The size of the brain had absolutely nothing to do with the intelligence of a person. What they did find after the fact is that it was actually those convolutions, the number of high points and low points on the brain, that made all the difference. So the more convolutions that you have, the more peaks and valleys is going to ultimately determine your IQ. The idea behind it is your brain works based off of these electrical impulses that are sent back and forth. And if you have more of these peaks and valleys, that means you have more surface area to your brain. If you have more surface area, you have more working space, which allows those connections to happen much faster and in higher quantity. And so ultimately that would lead to intelligence, not necessarily the size of the brain. And then they went on further to doing more research. And one of the things that they found were that babies that were born with fetal alcohol syndrome, they had nearly a smooth surface to their brain. And so that was just kind of proving their theory a little bit more. They found that those children that had the smoother brains had a lot of difficulty in learning and meeting their targets, their milestones as they went through the developmental process. And so that is, like I said, essentially where your IQ is going to be linked to. Then if you go back to the left, we have the diencephalon. The diencephalon is not a structure, it is a space. And within the diencephalon, you have two very important structures that are housed there. You have the hypothalamus and the thalamus. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about those right now because we have a slide on those later, but just understand the diencephalon is at the very core of your brain. It is a location, it's not an actual structure. And the two structures that you would have located there are going to be the hypothalamus and the thalamus. So then the last portion that we have on the left-hand side shows the brain stem. And this is where the brain is going to start to make the transition into the spinal cord. And you have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And so as you taper and move through those three structures, you are now transitioning from the brain portion into that spinal cord that is going to link to all the nerves that are going to go out to all the parts of your body. Now, if you move back over to the right, you have the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is a structure that, again, is pretty much right at the core of the brain, just above the diencephalon. And this is actually a bridge between the right and the left side of the brain. So you have the two hemispheres of the brain, and this is going to be the section that actually connects those two halves. And this is, again, the only place where the two sides of the brain are linked together. So they're in close proximity, obviously not a lot of extra space in the skull, but you have a very deep groove that is going to be located in the brain, just like we did in the spinal cord, how you had this fissure and the sulcus that made very deep cuts in the spinal cord, almost severing it into two. You have that same sort of setup in the brain, and the link between the two is going to be that corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum allows the right and left side of the brain to communicate with each other, but it's not a necessary link. There have been a number of surgeries and procedures that have been done throughout the years where that corpus callosum has been severed in order to block the two sides from being able to talk to each other. And a person will still survive, be able to function. It was actually a procedure that they did in epilepsy patients. And because in epilepsy, the nerves become overstimulated and ultimately results in a seizure, they thought that if they could cut the communication between the two sides of the brain, that they could reduce the likelihood of a seizure. And what happened was, in some patients, it was a great success. And the people would actually go down to not having seizures or having very few seizures in comparison to what they used to have. And in other patients, it made no difference. And so that's another big mystery in the scientific world as to why this is successful in some and not in all. Then we have the cerebellum. As I mentioned, that is kind of the mini-me of the brain. And it sits in the lower posterior region of the brain. And this is where a lot of your muscle coordination is going to come from. When you guys sit upright, most people don't realize that that actually takes effort to sit upright and not slide out of your chair or not tip over to the right or left. Also, your ability to know where your body is in relationship to the rest of your body. So if you were in a very dark room and couldn't see anything, you would still know where your body orientation was, where your arms were, where your legs were, if you were sitting upright or if you were laying down. And that is going to be that spatial awareness that you gain from the cerebellum. So posture, muscle coordination, things like that are going to stem from that cerebellum region. If you drop to the next slide, it shows you a closer up view of the meningeal layer. So you can see the skin, which would be the scalp. Then you can see the skull, and then it shows you the three motor layers of the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. And you can see where those are in relationship to each other. So same situation, same setup as what we had around the spinal cord. This is just showing you how it is positioned in relationship to the brain itself. The next slide that you guys have talks about the brain ventricles. And the brain ventricles are going to be these passageways that you have within the brain itself that allow for the cerebral spinal fluid to flow through the brain and make sure that you are constantly getting flushed with new CSF. So with the four ventricles, you have the two lateral ventricles, which are typically numbered 1 and 2. And if you excuse me, if you notice, the two lateral ventricles are going to come together. There's a tiny little interventricular foramen where they will meet together right at the core. And then running right through the middle of the brain, you would find the third ventricle. And it will continue to move back to basically when you're on point with the spinal cord, and that is where you would find the fourth ventricle. And if you think back to our talk on the spinal cord, obviously that is going to link to that central canal that you have running right through the middle of the spinal cord. And so that cerebral spinal fluid that runs right through the middle is going to be linked to that fourth ventricle. And you can see where that runs down right through the middle. So when we look at the ventricles of the brain, essentially what we're talking about are those chambers that hold the cerebral spinal fluid and flush that through the brain to make sure that it's getting the nutrients that it needs, that it's getting the ions delivered to it that it needs. Basically, this is the bathwater of the central nervous system. It is cleansing it, it's cleaning it, making sure that it is kept nourished, and then that cerebral spinal fluid is constantly drained off and new fluid is brought in just to make sure that it is clean and able to take care of the brain and the spinal cord. As you move down to the next slide, the lobes of the brain, it gives you a visual of where those are. And like I mentioned, they are named for the bones that cover them. So if you remember where your frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes are, or bones are, then tucked right underneath that is going to be where you have those lobes. Now, for some reason, my slide that talks about the functions of the lobe got separated from this picture. So if you find that slide, it's called Functions by Lobe, and it lists the 4 major lobes of the brain and talks about what they do. So with the frontal lobe, you have the ability to carry out higher level thinking, and that's really what happens within the frontal lobe. And that cause and effect, being able to say, okay, if I do this, this could potentially happen or be the outcome of that. So those higher level thinking skills, cause and effect, talking about the consequences of behavior, that is going to happen within that frontal region of the brain, which is also the last region of the brain to develop in the body. Parietal lobe is going to deal with, understanding speech, and then being able to translate that into emotions. So when you hear people talk, just being able to transition that into something that makes sense to you, and then also being able to turn that into something that you can relay to somebody else, how you're feeling, how that impacts you, and things of that nature. With the temporal lobe, if you look at where the temporal lobe is, it's right on point with the ear. So it would make sense that this is going to be the part that is going to be responsible or deal with the hearing. So as you guys take in that sensory information, not only being able to hear it, but then being able to connect the direction that it's coming from. And so if you hear something to this side, being able to turn and look and make that association as to what side of your body it's coming from. And then the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is, again, it's above the cerebellum, so it sits higher than cerebellum, but it is that posterior side or posterior location of the brain. And even though the eyes are on the front, that posterior or that occipital lobe is going to help with vision. So as images come into the front, they are eventually going to be transitioned to the back, processed, and then you guys will see whatever you are looking at. All right. So if you go to your slide that talks about the diencephalon, and this was something that had been shown in the original picture image, and I told you guys that the diencephalon itself is a space, but then within that space you have 2 structures, and the 2 structures that you have there are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, with these 2 structures, what you have is the the thalamus is going to be that part of the brain that is basically kind of the relay station for the entire brain. So you have all this sensory information that is coming in all the time. You are constantly getting bombarded with sensory information. And if I had you guys take just a second and turn off all the sound and pause the video and just sit and listen, you guys would be amazed at the stuff that's you're hearing that's going on around you that you really are not tuning into and that you are spacing out. Maybe the lights in the room where you're at are buzzing. Maybe you have a fish tank somewhere in the room that is making noise, or you have another pet or animal that's making noise, that you tune that out. And I'm sure you guys have all had a point in time where a song has been on the radio and you like the song, but something else grabs your attention, and before you know it, the song is over and you didn't even listen to it. So with the diencephalon, what that does is it has to take in all that sensory information, and then it has to kind of filter what is most important and what's priority. And then it delivers that information to the part of the brain to be processed. Like we just got done talking about with the lobes. You have your reasoning up front, you have your vision in the back, you have your hearing, you have all of that. And so as that information is coming into your central nervous system, it has to get delivered to the right part of the brain so it can be processed efficiently. And that's the job of the thalamus. High priority gets delivered first, and then once it's delivered to the right part of the brain, you can process it and figure out how you're going to respond to it. The hypothalamus gets its name because it is lower than the thalamus. So the hypothalamus is at the top of the diencephalon, and then tucked right underneath that is going to be the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to be connected to those things that are your homeostatic functions. So maintaining your heart rate, making sure that your blood pressure is where it's supposed to be, that your pH levels are where you're supposed to be. All of those things that help you maintain homeostasis within your body are going to be regulated and monitored by the hypothalamus. And again, when they start to fluctuate, the hypothalamus is one of the master endocrine glands that we have in the body, and it will start to pour endocrine hormones into the body to regulate and get those numbers back to where they need to be. Now, the last couple of slides that we have pertain to the cranial nerves, and we spent time with those within the last class. You guys went through the different lab activities. I'm kind of taking a look at the functions of those different nerves, kind of getting to play around with those. And the one thing with those cranial nerve tests, and I mentioned it in class, but just to kind of touch on it very quickly, when something happens with those nerves, obviously because they stem straight out of the brain, it can provide a lot of information to a physician as to what's going on. But if you guys think about the tests that you were carrying out, they weren't horribly in depth. They were simple, easy tests that you could do. For the most part, we were using products at home. Obviously, a physician would have medical equipment to use, but very simple tests that you could do, and just based off of simple reactions. Somebody smiles at you. Are you getting a full smile, or is one side of their face flat while the other side is actually carrying out the smile? Something that easy as just asking somebody to give you a smile can tell you a lot of information. It can tell you what part of the brain's being impacted, what nerves are being affected, and potentially leading to a diagnosis of what's going on with that person. So even though some of those tests, like I said, were not incredibly in depth, I just kind of wanted you guys to get a sense of how easy it can be to diagnose something that could be very serious. Now, I know there's a couple slides that I didn't talk about. The one that talks about hemisphere dominance, it's kind of interesting, and if you guys want to take a quick look at that, you are more than welcome to. I don't ever ask anybody to commit anything from that to memory, just simply because it ranges from person to person. For an overwhelming majority of people, it might hold true, but there's also enough of a percentage of people that it doesn't hold true for, as far as what hemisphere of your brain controls what in your body. So, like I said, it's kind of interesting to look at if you just understand that it's not something that is 100% and holds true all the time from one person to the next. So that concludes our discussion on the brain. And with the notes that you took today, I am going to ask you to bring those to our last and final class. So take down any of the notes that you want on your packet, and then make sure that when we meet that last time for the final that you have that with you. And I'll explain a little bit more about that on that final meeting. Again, we have our bone test. So the bones that you guys, those sheets that you were given, those are the ones we're going to test out on. We did a lot of reviews over the last few weeks. I posted the sheets on Blackboard for you guys. So if you want to practice, I left those sheets at the end of last class. If you pulled those, you can use those to practice. But working with those bones, if you have any questions between now and our final meeting, please send me an email. I will be more than happy to answer any questions on that. And then when we meet that night, you will take your final. Make sure that you have those notes with you, and then when you are done with your test, you will be free to go that night. So we do not meet for the entire time. I want everyone to have the time they need to test not feel like they're rushed or that anybody is waiting for them to get done with the test so that we can do other things. So you can kind of plan your night out according to that. Like I said, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you for our final.